They always told you not to look too long into a mirror at night. You never believed in those old superstitions, the ones about how mirrors could be portals to other worlds, or how they could trap your soul if you stared too long. You were logical, grounded in reality. Mirrors were just glass and silver, reflecting light and creating an image, nothing more. But tonight something was different. You had been working late, eyes glued to your computer screen, the blue light searing into your brain as you typed furiously to meet a deadline. The clock struck 2:00 a.m. when you finally finished. Your body screamed for sleep, but your mind was too wired, too tense to simply crawl into bed. You needed to unwind, maybe splash some water on your face and breathe. The bathroom was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the window. It was quiet, eerily so, and as you stepped inside, the silence pressed down on you like a weight. You flicked on the light, but the bulb flickered before dying out with a soft pop. You cursed under your breath and moved to open the cabinet for a new bulb, but paused when you caught sight of your reflection. At first, nothing seemed out of place. You looked tired, exhausted even, with dark circles under your eyes and hair slightly disheveled. But as you leaned closer to the mirror, you noticed something strange. Your reflection's eyes didn't quite match your own. They were duller, almost lifeless, as if they belonged to a corpse rather than a living person. You blinked, and for a moment, your reflection didn't. You stepped back, heart beginning to race. The logical part of your brain tried to reason it away. Maybe you were just overtired. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But then the reflection did something that made your blood run cold. It smiled. Not a normal smile, not the kind you would give yourself when feeling proud or amused. This was a slow, creeping grin, one that spread across its face like a crack in glass, distorting the features into something grotesque, something inhuman. You stumbled back, hitting the wall behind you, eyes locked on the mirror. The reflection was still smiling, but now it began to move. Its hand reached out, not towards you, but towards the glass, as if trying to push through the barrier that separated you. The surface of the mirror rippled like water under its touch. Your breath caught in your throat. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be happening. Mirrors don't do that. Reflections don't move on their own. You wanted to turn away, to run, but your body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The reflection's hand pressed harder against the glass, and you could hear a faint cracking sound, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. The mirror began to fracture, thin lines spreading out from where its hand had touched. But instead of shattering, the pieces started to peel away, curling back like the petals of a flower. Something was coming through. Your mind screamed at you to run, to get away from the mirror, but it was too late. The reflection's hand broke through the surface, now solid, now real, and it reached for you with pale, cold fingers. You could feel the icy chill radiating from it, the air around you growing colder by the second. The hand gripped your wrist, and you finally found your voice, letting out a scream that echoed through the house. You tried to pull away, but its grip was like iron, dragging you closer to the mirror. Your other hand frantically searched for anything to fight back, but all you found was the smooth surface of the sink. With one last desperate effort, you yanked your arm, trying to free yourself, but the reflection's strength was unnatural, inhuman. It pulled you towards the mirror, and as your face neared the glass, you could see into its eyes, those dead, soulless eyes, and behind them you saw something else, something dark and malevolent, lurking just beyond the surface, waiting to claim you. The last thing you saw before your head hit the mirror was your own reflection, grinning at you with that twisted smile. And then the glass shattered. Darkness swallowed you whole. You wake up, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. Your heart is pounding, and your body is trembling as you sit up in bed, eyes wide with fear. It was just a nightmare, you tell yourself. Just a horrible, vivid nightmare. But something doesn't feel right. You look around your room trying to calm yourself, but the unease lingers like a shadow that won't go away. Slowly you get out of bed, your legs shaky, and you make your way to the bathroom. You need to see for yourself to make sure it was just a dream. The bathroom is dark, but the moonlight is still there, faintly illuminating the room. You hesitate for a moment, then reach out to flick on the light. It turns on without a problem this time, and you let out a shaky breath of relief. But when you look into the mirror, your blood turns to ice. The reflection isn't yours. It's still you, the same face, the same features, but the eyes, they're not your eyes. They're dark, soulless, and they're smiling that same twisted smile. You try to move, to turn away, but your body won't obey. The reflection raises its hand and waves at you, and you feel a cold, creeping sensation in the pit of your stomach. And then it steps out of the mirror. You want to scream, to run, but you're frozen in place as it approaches you, its movement slow, deliberate. It reaches out, and when its fingers touch your skin, you feel a chill so deep it seems to seep into your bones. With a final terrified thought, you realize the truth. You're still in the mirror, trapped, watching helplessly as the thing that was once your reflection takes your place. And in the darkness, you can see countless other reflections, all trapped, all screaming silently behind the glass. The last thing you see before everything goes black is your own reflection, now grinning at you with those dead, hollow eyes. And then you're gone. It started with the sound of scratching in the walls. I thought it was mice at first, annoying but nothing out of the ordinary. It was an old building, after all. Creaks, groans, and vermin were just part of the deal. At least, that's what I told myself. But the scratching kept getting louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get out. I lived alone in a small, cluttered apartment, so the thought of an infestation was annoying at best, terrifying at worst. I didn't want to deal with traps or exterminators, but after a week of the constant noise, I had no choice. I started tearing apart the kitchen, pulling back cabinets, inspecting the walls. I even knocked on them to see if I could hear anything moving inside. That's when I saw it, the hole. It was small, no larger than a fist, hidden behind the fridge. At first, I thought it was just wear and tear, but when I shone a flashlight into it, I saw something I'll never forget. Tiny beady eyes stared back at me. Not mice eyes, no. These eyes were different. There was an intelligence behind them, a kind of knowing. And then it scurried away. I yanked my head back, heart racing. What the hell was that? I waited, listening for more scratching, but the apartment fell silent as sun. The sudden absence of noise was almost worse than the scratching. It was like whatever was in there had been listening to me, watching me. The next night I heard something new. It wasn't just scratching, it was humming. A soft, eerie melody that echoed through the walls, barely audible but persistent. It was wrong too, like it came from something that didn't understand how to make music but was trying anyway. I didn't sleep that night. The following day I was too terrified to go to work. The humming continued, growing louder, more distorted, as if whatever was in the walls was getting impatient. I kept pacing, peeking at the hole, but I couldn't bring myself to go near it. And then I heard the laughter. It wasn't just any laugh. It was childlike but warped, like a child who had learned to laugh by mimicking someone else, not because they understood joy. High-pitched, stuttering, and echoing throughout my entire apartment. That's when I saw it. I don't know how it got out. I never saw it crawl through the hole, but there it was, standing in the middle of my living room. A small teddy bear, no more than a foot tall, sewn together from mismatched materials. Its eyes were black beads glittering in the dim light. The fur was patchy, some parts worn down to the fabric beneath, while other parts looked fresh, almost too fresh, like it had been recently added. And then I noticed the bones. The bear wasn't just made of fabric and fluff. No, peeking through the seams were tiny bones, human bones. Little fingers, ribs, a skull fragment, all stitched into its body like grotesque accessories. I stood frozen, unable to move as the bear tilted its head at me. It waved. The laugh started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the bear itself. That same horrible, high-pitched imitation of a laugh echoed through the room as the thing took a step forward. My stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It took another step. And another. I backed up, finally snapping out of my paralysis. I needed to get out, to escape this nightmare. But just as I turned to bolt for the door, I felt something sharp grab my ankle. I looked down. Another bear, smaller but made of the same patchwork of fur and bones. Its tiny hand, or paw, whatever it was, dug its bony fingers into my leg, holding me in place with unnatural strength. I kicked, trying to shake it off, but it clung tighter, its black eyes staring up at me as it let out a sickening giggle. The first bear was closer now, its glassy eyes locked onto mine. It wasn't just a toy, it was something else, something worse. I remembered hearing stories about a creature like this, SCP-1N48, a teddy bear that could create others like itself using human parts. The Foundation had tried to contain it, but some of them, Bone Mama they called her, always found a way to make more. More bears, more bones. I fought harder, kicking at the smaller bear, but with every swing, I could hear the bones cracking under its fur. And still, it wouldn't let go. Then the door opened. Another bear stood in the doorway, larger than the others. This one had a face stitched together from the skin of someone I didn't recognize. But the eyes, they were human. Real human eyes. The bears were everywhere now, crawling out of the walls, from under the floorboards, even through the ceiling. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat as they swarmed me. Their tiny hands grabbed at my legs, my arms pulling me down. The last thing I saw was Bone Mama herself, the largest bear, leaning down, her human eyes twinkling as she smiled that sickening, stitched-together grin. And as she reached for my face, I realized what they were after. My bones. The flight was supposed to be routine. Just a red-eye from New York to Seattle, nothing special. You've taken this route a dozen times before. But tonight something felt off. You couldn't put your finger on it, but it lingered like an itch at the back of your mind. The airport was quiet, the boarding process uneventful, But there was a strange heaviness in the air as you took your seat in row 17. The plane was unusually empty. There were maybe 20 other passengers scattered across the seats, and most were already dozing off as you settled in, plugging in your headphones to drown out the drone of the engines. It was late and you were tired, but sleep wouldn't come. Something about the cabin felt wrong. Maybe it was the lighting, the way the fluorescence flickered slightly every now and then. Or maybe it was the air, which smelled stale, almost metallic, as if the filtration system was failing. You tried to shake off the unease and focused on the in-flight movie, hoping it would distract you. It didn't. About an hour into the flight, the plane hit some turbulence, jolting you in your seat. Not unusual, but it didn't stop. The lights dimmed for a moment, then flickered back on. You glanced around. No one else seemed to notice or care. The hum of the engines droned on, but there was something odd in the sound, like a low thrum beneath it that you couldn't quite place. The turbulence stopped as quickly as it started, but the cabin felt colder. You glanced at the overhead vents, but no air was blowing. You rubbed your arms, trying to warm up, but the chill clung to you like a second skin. That's when you saw her, a flight attendant, standing at the front of the plane, her back to you. She was wearing an old-fashioned uniform, something from the 70s or 80s, definitely not the standard uniform for this airline. You couldn't see her face, but her posture was stiff, almost robotic. She didn't seem to be doing anything, just standing there, unnaturally still. Then from behind you, a voice whispered, "Help me!" You froze. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the plane, but you knew you heard it, a soft, pleading voice, like it was coming from someone far away. Slowly you turned your head, scanning the empty rows behind you. There was no one there. Your heart began to race. The voice came again, closer this time. "Help me, please." Your breath hitched. It wasn't just the voice, it was the tone. Desperate, sad, and the closer it got, the more it sent shivers down your spine. You were about to call for a flight attendant, for anyone, when you noticed something horrifying. The other passengers, they weren't moving. They were all sitting still, eerily still, like statues. No one shifted, no one blinked, no one even breathed. The man 2 rows ahead, who had been fidgeting with his phone earlier, was now completely rigid, eyes staring blankly ahead. The woman across the aisle, who had been reading a book, was frozen mid-turn of a page. Panic gripped you. You wanted to scream, to get up and run down the aisle, but your body wouldn't respond. Your limbs felt heavy, as if weighed down by an invisible force. The plane hummed along, the engine steady, but the silence inside the cabin was deafening. Then, out of the corner of your eye, you saw her again, the flight attendant. This time she was standing right beside you. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, and her eyes were dark, hollow voids. Her lips were cracked and parted, and from her mouth that same whisper escaped. "Help me!" You tried to scream, but nothing came out. Your throat tightened as if something was constricting it, holding you in place. The flight attendant's hand reached out, her fingers brushing against your arm. Her touch was ice cold, like death itself. "Please help me." You managed to break free of your paralysis, jerking back in your seat. The flight attendant vanished, disappearing into thin air, as if she had never been there at all. You gasped for breath, heart pounding in your chest, your hands shaking uncontrollably. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. You had to be dreaming. Frantically, you unbuckled your seatbelt and stood up, stumbling into the aisle. You had to find someone, anyone. You rushed to the front of the plane, past the rows of frozen passengers, your heart racing faster with every step. The door to the cockpit was just ahead, but when you reached it, the door creaked open. Inside, there was no one. No pilots, no co-pilots. The cockpit was empty. Your blood ran cold as you stared at the vacant seats. The controls were steady, the plane flying itself. How was that possible? Panic gripped you as you backed away, your mind racing for answers. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, plunging the cabin into darkness. For a moment, you stood there, enveloped by the oppressive blackness, the hum of the engines now seeming distant, almost muffled. Then the lights flickered back on, but the cabin was no longer empty. The passengers, Those frozen statues were now standing in the aisles, their eyes fixed on you, unblinking. Their mouths hung open, but no sound came out. They were closer, inching toward you, one by one, their movements slow and deliberate. Your breath caught in your throat as they advanced, their lifeless eyes locked onto you. You backed away, retreating into the cockpit, but there was nowhere to go. You were trapped. And then you saw her again, the flight attendant, standing in the doorway, her hollow eyes staring into your soul, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rotting blackened teeth. This time she didn't whisper, she laughed. And then everything went black.
There's something comforting about a bowl of noodles. Whether it's late at night after a long day or a quick meal to ease your hunger, it's one of those foods that's simple but satisfying. At least that's how it used to feel. Before everything changed. I used to work late at a tech company in the city. Nights stretched into the early morning hours, and I'd often find myself too tired to cook anything complicated. That's how I stumbled upon Noodle Express, a small takeout joint just a few blocks from my apartment. It wasn't flashy, one of those hole-in-the-wall places with a dim sign that flickered when it rained. But their noodles? Unbelievably good. Spicy, rich, and addictive. I couldn't get enough. It became a routine. Late shift, exhausted walk home, and a stop by Noodle Express. The owner, an older man with a thin, crooked smile, always greeted me the same way. "Ah, welcome back. Your usual?" I didn't even have to respond anymore. He'd hand me the white takeout box before I could pull out my wallet. The noodles were always hot, always perfectly cooked, and always, without fail, left me craving more. I never thought much about it. Until the night that everything felt different. It was raining hard that evening, the kind of rain that makes the city streets gleam under the streetlights like black glass. Noodle Express was still open, of course. It was always open no matter how late. But tonight, something felt off the moment I stepped through the door. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was the usual rich aroma of noodles, but there was something else underneath it. Something metallic like blood or rust. I wrinkled my nose and glanced at the counter where the owner usually stood. But he wasn't there. In fact, there was no one behind the counter at all. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the tiny, dimly lit space. No answer. For a moment, I considered leaving, but the craving for those noodles gnawed at me. I was hungry, starving actually, and something about the place kept me rooted to the spot. The back kitchen door swung open, and the old man appeared, carrying a large metal pot. His smile was even more crooked than usual, his eyes a little too wide. "Ah, there you are. Late tonight, huh? No worries, no worries. I have something special for you." I hesitated, but before I could say anything he was already packing the noodles into the white takeout box. There was something about the way he moved, quick, almost frantic, that set me on edge. "This batch is extra fresh. Made it just for you," he said, sliding the box across the counter with that same unsettling smile. I wanted to ask what he meant by extra fresh, but the hunger was too strong. I handed him the money and left without saying another word. The rain pelted down as I made my way home, and the smell of the noodles wafting from the box was overwhelming. It drowned out the rain, the noise of the city, everything. All I could think about was getting home and devouring that meal. When I finally sat down at my kitchen table and opened the box, the smell hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just savory, it was intoxicating. I grabbed my chopsticks and dug in without a second thought. The first bite was different. The noodles were just as perfectly cooked as ever, but there was an odd texture to them. They weren't chewy in the usual way. They were soft, too soft. But I didn't stop. My hunger was insatiable. I kept eating, slurping down bite after bite, barely pausing to breathe. That's when I noticed something strange. In the tangle of noodles there was something that didn't belong. Something pale. I pulled it out and my stomach turned. It was a small bone. Too small to be from any animal typically used in food. I gagged, but before I could react, I spotted something else tangled in the noodles. This time it was a thin, fleshy strip. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what it was. Skin. Human skin. The realization hit me like ice water, and I dropped the chopsticks, backing away from the table. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of sick joke? Had I been eating? I ran to the bathroom and vomited, the taste of the noodles lingering in the back of my throat, no matter how hard I tried to purge it. My head spun as I splashed cold water on my face. What the hell had I just eaten? I stumbled back into the kitchen, heart racing, hands trembling. The takeout box was still there on the table, the noodles spilling out like a grotesque, tangled mass. And there, nestled in the center, was something even worse. An eyeball. I stared in horror, unable to look away. The small, glossy orb stared back at me, lifeless and glassy, nestled among the noodles like some kind of sick garnish. My mind went blank. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but the phone felt miles away and my legs refused to move. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached the door, every fiber of my being screaming to turn back, to run. But something compelled me to open it. My hand trembled as I gripped the doorknob and slowly pulled it open. It was the old man from Noodle Express. He stood there, drenched from the rain, his crooked smile wider than ever. But his eyes were wrong. They were blank, lifeless, just like the eyeball in the noodles. And in his hands he held another white takeout box. "You didn't finish?" he said, his voice low and cold. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, rooted to the spot as the old man slowly stepped inside, placing the new box on the table beside the half-eaten noodles. "This one's fresher," he whispered, his smile stretching unnaturally wide, almost splitting his face in two. "You'll like it better." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The old man turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. For a long moment I stood there in silence, staring at the two takeout boxes, my mind reeling. Finally I forced myself to move. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and rushed to the door. But as I stepped into the hallway I froze. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them. All of me. Pictures of me walking home, sitting at my desk, eating noodles. Each one was dated, and each one showed me with a white takeout box from Noodle Express. The latest one was from tonight. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was far away from that place, from that man, from those noodles. But as I ran I could still taste them. No matter how hard I tried to forget, the taste lingered. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the old man's voice, whispering in the back of my mind. "You didn't finish?" Every small town has that one house. The one that no one goes near, the one with the broken windows and peeling paint, sitting on the edge of town like a ghost. For us, it was the house on Ashgrove Lane. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Kids would dare each other to go inside, but no one ever did. Not really. Not until that night. It was the middle of fall, the leaves piling up in the gutters, the wind cutting through the air like a blade. My friends and I had just turned 16, that age where you're too old for childish fears but still feel the thrill of danger. We were bored, restless, and looking for something to do. That's when Matt suggested it. "Let's go to the house on Ashgrove," he said, grinning like he'd just thought of the greatest idea in the world. We all knew the stories. People said the house was cursed, that something terrible happened there years ago. Some said it was haunted by the family who used to live there. Others claimed it was something far worse. But Matt didn't believe in any of that. He called it urban legend nonsense. None of us wanted to look like cowards, so we agreed. It was a short walk from Matt's place, just a few blocks away from the town center. As we approached the house, my heart began to pound harder in my chest. Even from a distance, it had an aura of decay, like it was rotting from the inside out. The roof sagged in places, the windows were dark and empty, and the porch looked like it might collapse if you stepped on it. "See? Nothing to it," Matt said as we reached the gate, giving it a nudge with his foot. The rusty hinges squealed as the gate swung open, and we stepped onto the overgrown lawn. "I don't like this," I muttered under my breath, but no one seemed to hear me. Or maybe they did but didn't want to admit they felt the same way. Matt led the way, striding confidently up to the front door. He tried the knob, it was unlocked. "Easy," he said, pushing the door open with a loud creak. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. The dim moonlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It was unnervingly still, like the house was holding its breath, waiting. The four of us, me, Matt, Sarah, and Jason, stood in the foyer for a moment, looking around. The wallpaper was peeling, curling at the edges like it was trying to escape the walls. The furniture was old, covered in sheets that looked more like burial shrouds than protection from dust. "I say we split up," Matt said, clearly enjoying himself. "Two of us go upstairs, two check out the basement." I wasn't thrilled with the idea, but no one spoke up to challenge him. Jason and Sarah volunteered to go upstairs, leaving me with Matt to check the basement. Lucky me. We found the door to the basement at the back of the house, half hidden behind a rotting curtain. Matt yanked it open with a bit too much enthusiasm, and a gust of cold, damp air hit us in the face. The steps leading down were narrow and steep, creaking with each step we took. I held onto the railing, my flashlight sweeping the darkness as we descended. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement was bigger than I expected, with a low ceiling and exposed pipes running along the walls. The concrete floor was cracked, and there were old, rusted tools scattered around, along with a few wooden crates that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. It was cold, colder than it should have been for early fall. Matt walked ahead of me, his flashlight sweeping back and forth. "Nothing down here. Told you this place was just a dump." But I wasn't so sure. There was something off about the basement. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. And then I heard it, a faint sound like whispering coming from the far corner of the room. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Matt stopped, turning his flashlight toward the corner. "Hear what?" The whispering grew louder, like voices overlapping, but I couldn't make out any words. It sounded like it was coming from behind one of the crates. My heart raced and I wanted to turn around and leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Matt, however, was unfazed. He walked over to the crate and pulled it aside. There, in the wall, was a small door. It was barely 3 feet tall, made of old wood with rusted hinges. The kind of door you'd expect to see in a child's playhouse, not in a basement. It didn't belong there. And the whispering was louder now, coming from behind that door. Matt grinned, more excited than ever. "Now this is interesting." I wanted to stop him, but before I could say anything, he grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. The moment it swung wide, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. Inside the door was a small, dark space no bigger than a closet. And there, in the middle of the floor, was a doll. It was old, filthy, its clothes tattered and covered in dirt. Its eyes were made of glass, staring straight ahead, unblinking. But what made my stomach churn was its face. Half of it was missing, like it had been ripped off. The exposed part of its head was covered in scratches, as though someone, or something, had clawed at it. "I'm not touching that," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But Matt, of course, had no such reservations. He reached in and grabbed the doll by the arm. The moment he lifted it out of the room, the temperature dropped. It felt like the air was being sucked out of the basement, like the house was reacting to us, to the doll. And then, from somewhere above us, we heard a loud crash. "Sarah? Jason?" I called out, but there was no response. Matt didn't seem concerned. Probably just knocked something over. I wasn't so sure. We made our way back up the stairs, my legs shaking with every step. The moment we reached the main floor, I knew something was wrong. The house had changed. The furniture, once covered in dusty sheets, was now uncovered, the chairs and tables arranged differently. The wallpaper that had been peeling was now whole, though faded. It was like the house had reverted to some previous state, as if we had stepped back in time. "Sarah? Jason?" Matt called out again. No answer. We moved through the house, the floor creaking under our feet, but the silence was overwhelming. It felt like the house was holding its breath again, waiting for something. We made our way to the staircase and found Sarah's phone lying at the bottom step. The screen cracked. I picked it up, my heart racing. Something's not right. Matt was about to respond when we heard it. Footsteps coming from upstairs. Slow, deliberate. They echoed through the house, each one sending a shiver down my spine. "Sarah? Jason?" Matt called out, but again no answer. The footsteps continued, getting closer. We both stood frozen, staring up at the top of the stairs. And then, from the darkness, something stepped into view. It wasn't Sarah or Jason. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were sunken, hollow, and its mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural grin. It stood there, swaying slightly, staring down at us with those empty eyes. Matt dropped the doll. The figure moved, slowly descending the stairs, its bony hands reaching out as it did. The air grew colder, the walls seemed to close in, and I could barely breathe. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but somehow I managed to grab Matt's arm and pull him toward the door. We ran. We didn't look back. The last thing I heard as we fled the house was the sound of that thing's footsteps, following us down the stairs, relentless, hungry. We never saw Sarah or Jason again. In the mountains of Albania, there are villages that seem forgotten by time. The kind of places that don't show up on maps, where the old ways are still respected and whispered stories pass through generations like folklore. I didn't grow up there, but my grandparents did, and every summer my family would travel back to their small village, Rezja, for a few weeks. It was a quiet place, nestled in the shadow of the mountains, with stone houses and narrow, winding paths. But there was something else about Rezja that always felt off, something darker. I first heard the story of Lugina e Pershperejev, or the Whispering Valley, from my grandmother when I was 12. I remember the way she looked at me, her wrinkled face unusually stern, warning me never to go near that place. The valley was a long, narrow stretch of land just beyond the village, hidden by thick forests and jagged cliffs. No one ever went there. The villagers treated it like it didn't exist, a cursed spot they preferred to forget. My cousins and I were always curious about the valley despite the warnings, or maybe because of them. I guess when you're young, the allure of forbidden places is too strong to ignore. That summer, we decided we'd finally go see it for ourselves. It was a hot, dry afternoon when we set out. The sun was high and the village was quiet, with most of the older folks taking their afternoon rest. We slipped out of the house unnoticed, carrying just a flashlight and some snacks, like it was going to be a fun little adventure. The path leading to the valley was overgrown and steep, winding through dense trees that seemed to press in on us the farther we went. After about an hour of walking, we reached the edge of the valley. It was different than I'd imagined. The valley was narrow, with steep cliffs on either side, and the grass was dry and brown, almost brittle. There were no birds, no insects, just an eerie stillness that hung in the air. But the thing that struck me the most was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. It was completely silent. Even the wind didn't seem to blow there. My cousins Tom and Eli were excited though. They started down the slope into the valley without hesitation, laughing and calling out to each other, their voices sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. I hesitated, glancing around. Something about the place felt wrong, like the air was too thick, too heavy. "Come on," Eli shouted, waving me over. "Don't be such a chicken." Reluctantly, I followed. The ground beneath our feet was dry and cracked, and the deeper into the valley we went, the more isolated I felt. It was like we had entered a different world, far from the safety of the village. That's when we first heard it. A faint whispering. At first I thought it was the wind. But there was no wind. The sound seemed to come from all around us, soft and unintelligible, like voices carried on a breeze we couldn't feel. My skin prickled and I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The whispers were growing louder, clearer, but I still couldn't make out the words. It was like multiple people were speaking at once, overlapping, their voices low and urgent. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom and Eli paused, exchanging uneasy glances. "It's probably just the echo or something," Tom said, though he didn't sound convinced. He was trying to sound brave, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We continued on, but the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow more persistent the deeper into the valley we went. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Ahead of us, standing in the middle of the valley, was a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, his clothes old and tattered, like they hadn't been changed in years. His back was to us, his head slightly bowed as if listening to something. My heart pounded in my chest and I grabbed Eli's arm, stopping him in his tracks. "Look," I whispered. We all stared at the figure, frozen in place. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though they were trying to warn us of something. The man didn't move, didn't turn around. He just stood there, utterly still. "Who is that?" Eli asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, taking a step back. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get out of the valley as fast as possible. But before I could say anything, Tom, always the bravest, or the most foolish, called out. "Hey, you okay?" The man didn't respond. He didn't move. And then, slowly, he began to turn around. I wish I could say that I saw his face, but I didn't. Or at least not a human face. What turned to face us was wrong, twisted. It was like his skin was stretched too tight over his bones, his eyes too wide, too dark, like empty voids staring into us. And his mouth, it wasn't a mouth. It was just a black hole, gaping and unnatural. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, all screaming at once, and the air around us felt like it was vibrating with the sound. We ran. We bolted up the slope, back toward the village, our legs burning with the effort. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel something behind us, feel it getting closer. The whispers chased us, growing louder, more insistent, like they were trying to pull us back into the valley. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else, and I didn't stop running until we were back in the village. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we looked back, but the valley was empty. There was no sign of the man, or whatever he was. But the whispers, they stayed with us, faint, just on the edge of hearing, like they had followed us back. That night I couldn't sleep. The whispers were still there, growing louder in the darkness. I heard them in the walls, in the wind, even in my dreams. I woke up several times, covered in sweat, convinced that if I opened my eyes, I'd see that twisted face staring back at me. The next morning Eli was gone. We searched the entire village, but there was no sign of him. My family called the police, but the locals knew the truth. They whispered about the valley, about the curse. They said no one ever returned from Lugina e Pershperachev. I never told anyone about the man we saw, or the whispers that still haunt me to this day. But I know what happened to Eli. The valley took him, just like it had taken others before him. And I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me too. Because the whispers haven't stopped. They're still here, growing louder every night. It started with a single old dollar bill. Not just any dollar bill, this one was strange. I found it one afternoon when I was short on cash and feeling desperate. My rent was overdue, my car needed repairs, and my bank account was practically empty. The only reason I even noticed the bill was because of how out of place it looked. It was crumpled, old, and almost brittle, sitting on the floor of a dusty antique store I had wandered into while looking for a job. There was something off about it. The ink was slightly faded, the paper seemed thinner, and there was a faint symbol drawn in the corner, a circle with a triangle inside. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured it was some kind of weird doodle from a previous owner. I picked it up, smoothed it out, and slid it into my pocket. As I left the store, I didn't realize how quickly my life was about to change. That night, I found myself needing to buy groceries, so I used the dollar bill at a small convenience store. The cashier barely looked at it, shoving it into the till as I paid for my food. It felt good to spend the last bit of cash I had, like I was getting rid of a burden. But when I got home, things started to get strange. I pulled out my wallet to put away my change, and there it was, the same crumpled dollar bill. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe I'd accidentally taken it back with my change. I laughed it off, figuring it was no big deal, and tossed it onto my kitchen counter. The next day, I paid for a cup of coffee at a cafe down the street, handing over the dollar bill again, this time making sure it was the same one. It had the same faded ink, the same odd symbol. I even watched the barista place it into the register. But when I got home later that evening and emptied my pockets, the dollar bill was back. That's when I began to worry. I tried getting rid of it in every way I could think of. I left it at stores, gave it to beggars, and even tried throwing it away. Each time it would find its way back to me. It didn't matter what I did. By the end of the day, I would always find that crumpled dollar waiting for me in my wallet, or sitting on my desk, or even lying in my bed. And the symbol, the strange triangle inside the circle, seemed to grow darker each time it reappeared. I started to feel paranoid, like something was watching me. It was just a dollar bill, but it felt heavier than that, like there was something sinister behind it. After a week, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus at work. All I could think about was the dollar and why it wouldn't leave me alone. One night, I decided to destroy it. I took the dollar out to my backyard, held it over an old metal barrel, and lit it on fire. The flame caught, flickering wildly as it consumed the paper. I stood there, watching as the bill curled and blackened, waiting for it to be nothing but ash. But before it could finish burning, the fire died out. The bill was mostly intact, charred at the edges but still whole. The symbol, however, was gone. In its place there was something new, a single word written in jagged letters. Oh. A chill ran down my spine. That night I barely slept, plagued by nightmares. In my dreams I was trapped in a room filled with stacks of dollar bills, each one whispering that word over and over. Oh, oh, oh. The sound grew louder, more frantic, until I woke up in a cold sweat. The next morning I went to the bank. I wanted to deposit the bill, get it out of my hands once and for all. The teller gave me a strange look as she examined it, but said nothing as she processed the deposit. I felt a wave of relief as I left the bank, hoping that was the end of it. But later that day my phone rang. It was the bank. They told me there had been an error with my account, that something unusual had happened with my recent deposit. They couldn't explain it, but the dollar bill had somehow reappeared, marked as a withdrawal in my name. Worse still, my balance had dropped significantly. Hundreds of dollars had vanished overnight, and the teller said it looked like I was in serious debt, an amount far greater than I'd ever borrowed. I rushed home, heart pounding, and checked my wallet. The dollar bill was back. The word O had grown larger, darker. And beneath it, a new phrase had appeared, debt paid in full. I didn't understand. I hadn't borrowed anything, hadn't taken out any loans. But when I checked my bank account again, the debt had grown even larger. Every time I tried to get rid of the dollar, more money vanished from my account. It was as though the bill was siphoning off everything I had, everything I'd ever earned. Desperate, I turned to the internet, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. That's when I found a forum post, buried deep in a thread about cursed objects. Someone had posted a warning describing an ancient curse tied to money, a curse that could never be broken, only passed on. The only way to escape it, the post claimed, was to trick someone into accepting the dollar willingly. Only then would the curse transfer to them. But once passed, there was no going back. The original owner would be free, but the new owner would be doomed to suffer the same fate. I stared at the dollar bill in my hand, its edges blackened, the word O staring back at me like an accusation. I didn't know what to do. Could I really pass this curse on to someone else, knowing what it would do to them? But as the days passed, my bank account drained further and I started to panic. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't lose everything. The dollar bill had ruined my life. My only option, terrible as it was to give it away, to pass the curse on to someone else. That's what I did. One night, I went to a bar, struck up a conversation with a stranger, and convinced him to take the dollar bill as a tip. He smiled, thanked me, and slipped it into his pocket. I left the bar feeling a sick mixture of guilt and relief. But the curse was gone. I was free. Or so I thought. The next morning, I woke up to find a single crumpled dollar bill lying on my bedside table. The symbol was back. And underneath it, in bold, dark letters, were the words, "You can't escape debt." I always thought banks were boring places. Rows of tellers, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the rhythmic clicking of keyboards, and the quiet buzz of people going about their business. But the bank where I worked was different. There was something wrong with it, something I couldn't explain, and I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't experienced it firsthand. It started about 6 months after I got the job at First National Trust Bank, an old institution that had been around for more than a century. The building itself was ancient, ornate stonework, high ceilings, and massive vault doors that looked like they belonged in a museum. But I liked the job well enough. The pay was decent, the people were fine, and I got to go home every day at 5. There was only one rule that stood out during orientation: never enter Vault 7. At first it seemed like a joke. The bank had several vaults, and most of them were used to store important documents, valuable items, and sometimes cash for high-profile clients. Vault 7, though, was different. It was off-limits to everyone except for a select few people, none of whom I ever met. The employees joked about it, saying that Vault 7 was where the bank kept its dirty secrets. Some people said it was haunted, but no one ever really believed it. I didn't either, until I was given the keys to the vault. It was a quiet afternoon, and the bank was about to close when my supervisor, Ms. Hale, called me into her office. She was a strict woman, no nonsense, with sharp features and graying hair pulled back into a tight bun. She handed me a small envelope with a brass key inside, engraved with the number 7. "I need you to take this to Vault 7, she said without a trace of emotion. "And don't ask any questions." I hesitated, confused. "But, we're not supposed to go in there, right?" I thought only certain. She cut me off with a glare. "Just do as you're told. Go down there, place the key in the lock, and come back. Do not enter the vault. Do not open the door. Understand?" I nodded, feeling the weight of the key in my palm, heavier than I expected. The walk to the basement where the vaults were kept felt longer than usual. The fluorescent lights flickered as I descended the stairs, and the air grew cooler, almost damp. The hallway that led to the vaults was lined with heavy steel doors, each one numbered in brass plates. Vault 7 was at the very end. When I reached the door, my breath caught in my throat. It was bigger than the others, much bigger. The steel door was almost twice the height of the others, with intricate engravings running along the edges, strange symbols that looked old, ancient. I'd never noticed them before. For a moment I considered turning back. Something about that door unsettled me. It wasn't just the size, it was the feeling of dread that seemed to radiate from it, like it was watching me. But I had a job to do. I took the key out of my pocket and, with a shaky hand, slid it into the lock. It clicked smoothly and I turned it, expecting nothing more than a mechanical whir of the vault door resetting. Instead, the vault door shifted slightly. A low, metallic groan echoed through the hallway, and the door cracked open by just an inch. A thin sliver of darkness spilled out from the gap, colder than the air around me. My stomach churned and a part of me screamed to run. I stepped back, heart racing, remembering Ms. Hale's words, "Do not open the door." But the door had opened on its own. I stood there for what felt like minutes, frozen, unsure of what to do. Curiosity gnawed at me. If the door was already open, surely it wouldn't hurt just to take a quick look. I mean, how often does someone get to see the inside of a secret vault, right? Against my better judgment, I approached the door and peered through the gap. At first, I didn't see anything. Just darkness. The air inside the vault smelled wrong. It was like the scent of old rotting wood mixed with something sour, metallic. My eyes adjusted and I could barely make out shapes, boxes, maybe shelves, but they were too far back to be clear. Then I heard it. A faint scratching noise, like nails dragging across stone. It was coming from deep within the vault, slow and deliberate. I leaned in closer, my breath shallow, trying to figure out what it was. And then something moved. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifted in the back of the vault. It was subtle at first, like a flicker at the edge of my vision. But it grew, expanding, reaching toward the crack in the door. My pulse quickened and I took a step back, eyes wide, but I couldn't tear myself away. The shadow slid forward, pulling itself into the sliver of light from the hallway. I could see it more clearly now, a formless mass writhing like it was made of smoke or tar. And in the center of it, two pale, glowing eyes blinked open, locking onto me. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The scratching noise grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was in that vault was trying to get out. My back hit the opposite wall, and I realized with horror that the door was opening wider on its own. The thing inside the vault moved closer, and I could hear a low whisper, barely audible over the scratching. I couldn't make out the words, but it felt like it was calling to me, beckoning me to come closer. The air was thick, suffocating, and the cold had seeped into my bones. Suddenly, the vault door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I yelped, the sound echoing down the hall. The key dropped from my trembling hand, clattering to the floor. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, sprinting up the stairs, my legs shaking. I burst through the door back into the main lobby, gasping for breath. Miss Hale was waiting for me, her face expressionless as ever. "Did you do it?" she asked, her tone flat. I nodded, too shaken to speak. "Good," she said. "You're done for today. Go home." I didn't argue. I grabbed my things and left, my mind racing. What the hell had I seen? What was in Vault 7? That night I barely slept. My dreams were filled with the sound of scratching and those glowing eyes staring into my soul. I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I could still hear the whispers. The next day I was called into Miss Hale's office again. She didn't ask about what happened in the vault. Instead, she handed me another envelope. Inside was another key, this one labeled Vault 6. I stared at her, my mouth dry. What's in the vaults? Miss Hale looked at me, her cold eyes betraying no emotion. "That's not for you to know," she said quietly. "Just follow orders. It's safer that way." I left the office, key in hand, feeling a growing sense of dread. Vault 6 was next. What would I find there? What was I being pulled into? That night the scratching returned. But this time it wasn't in my dreams. It was coming from inside my apartment. There was a story that had been passed down through generations of jewelers about a diamond that no one should ever touch. A flawless, radiant gem called the Diamond of Despair. The legend said it was cursed, though no one could explain exactly why. It was rumored to have surfaced in royal treasuries and private collections over the centuries, but each owner suffered a mysterious fate. It vanished from history until one day it reappeared. Lucas was a jeweler struggling to keep his shop afloat. One day, a mysterious man entered his shop, his face hidden under the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Without a word, the man placed a small velvet pouch on the counter and slid it toward Lucas. Curiosity piqued, Lucas opened it and gasped. Inside was the most exquisite diamond he had ever seen, glittering with an otherworldly light. "I need this appraised," the man whispered in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping across stone. Lucas agreed, his mind already racing with thoughts of how much this diamond would be worth. The man left, and Lucas began to study the gem under his microscope. The diamond had no imperfections. It was flawless, perfect beyond reason. As he examined it, he noticed something odd. The light refracting through the diamond cast strange, twisted shapes on the walls, almost like faces. That night, Lucas dreamed of a vast, dark void. In the center of it stood the diamond, glowing faintly. Surrounding it were shadowy figures, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached out to him as if begging for release, but the closer he got, the colder he felt, as if his soul was being drained. He woke up in a cold sweat, the image of the diamond burned into his mind. Over the next few days things began to change. Lucas started seeing those same twisted faces everywhere. The reflection in his windows, the shimmer on his countertops, even in the water as he washed his hands. He could feel the diamond watching him even when it was locked away in the safe. One night he heard whispers, soft, insistent voices calling his name. The safe where the diamond was kept rattled as if something inside was trying to escape. Against his better judgment, he opened it. The diamond lay there, glowing faintly, but something was different. The faces reflected in its facets were no longer just random shapes. They were people. And they were screaming. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, and the faces began to twist and writhe as if they were alive. Lucas backed away, but the room grew colder, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Then he saw her, a woman's face, the most distinct of them all, trapped inside the diamond. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her mouth moved silently as if begging for help. Suddenly the lights in the shop flickered and went out. In the darkness, Lucas heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. He fumbled for the light, his heart pounding in his chest. When he turned it back on, the diamond was gone. In its place was the velvet pouch, empty and tattered. Panicked, Lucas searched the shop, but the diamond had vanished. The only thing left was the woman's face, burned into his mind. That night, Lucas packed up and fled, abandoning his shop, but the curse followed him. Wherever he went, he saw her, reflected in windows, in the glint of passing cars, in the gleam of polished surfaces. She was always there, trapped, watching him with desperate eyes. He could feel his sanity slipping away. No matter where he went, the diamond, or whatever evil had attached itself to him, would not let go. He would never be free. A month later, Lucas was found dead in a cheap motel room. His body was pale, his skin cold, but what shocked the authorities most was the look on his face, frozen in a twisted expression of terror. Clutched in his hand was a small velvet pouch, empty and torn. The diamond of despair had claimed another victim. And somewhere out there, in another forgotten shop, it waits for its next owner. Afghanistan is a land of harsh beauty, mountain ranges that scrape the sky, desert plains that stretch endlessly, and villages where time seems to have stopped. It's a country shaped by conflict and resilience. But some say the land itself is cursed, that its sands carry the weight of ancient, forgotten terrors. I never believed any of that. Not until my last tour of duty. I was stationed at Forward Operating Base, FOB, Hammer in the southern province of Helmand. It was 2012, and we were there on a routine mission, stabilize the region, keep an eye on insurgents, and provide support to local forces. The usual grind. I was part of a tight-knit squad of 8, led by Staff Sergeant Cole, a hard-ass with a strong sense of duty. We were brothers in arms, and we'd been through hell together in multiple tours. I trusted those men with my life. FOB Hammer was an old base, thrown together quickly during the height of the war. It wasn't much to look at, just a few concrete buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence and some hastily dug trenches. The nearest village, Darvash, was about 10 miles away, and we patrolled it regularly. Darvash was like many of the villages in Helmand, poverty-stricken, battered by years of war, but still hanging on. The locals mostly kept to themselves, but there was something about Darvash that felt different. The villagers always seemed wary, like they were hiding something. They'd avoid eye contact, speak in hushed tones, and they never, ever ventured out after dark. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. It all started one evening during a routine patrol. We were driving through the desert in our convoy when one of the Humvees broke down. It wasn't unusual, the heat and dust took a toll on the vehicles. Private Morales and I stayed behind to help fix it while the rest of the convoy continued on. The sun was setting and the desert was beginning to cool, casting long shadows over the dunes. As we worked on the engine, I noticed something odd in the distance. A figure standing on top of a dune just watching us. I nudged Morales. "You see that?" He squinted and nodded. "Yeah, weird. You think it's a local?" "Maybe. But why the hell would anyone be out here alone?" We kept working, trying to ignore it, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, as if it were waiting for something. My gut told me something was off. After what felt like an eternity, the convoy circled back to pick us up. I looked up at the dune one last time before getting into the Humvee, but the figure was gone. Back at the base, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I told Cole about the figure, but he shrugged it off. Could have been a shepherd or something. Locals wander around all the time. But it didn't feel right. Something about the way it had just stood there, motionless, made my skin crawl. I tried to forget about it, but that night as I lay in my bunk, I heard something strange, faint whispers carried on the wind. I thought it was just my imagination, the sound of the desert wind whipping through the base. But the next morning I found Morales staring out into the desert, his face pale. "Did you hear it last night?" he asked quietly. I hesitated. "The wind." He shook his head. "No voices. It sounded like they were calling to me." I laughed it off, told him he was just tired, but deep down I knew exactly what he meant. There was something out there, something watching us. And it was getting closer. A few days later we were ordered to head back to Darvash for another patrol. The village was always quiet when we arrived, the streets deserted, save for a few old men and children who watched us warily from doorways. But this time was different. The village felt wrong. It was too quiet. No one came out to greet us, and even the air felt heavy, like the silence was pressing down on us. As we moved through the streets, Cole ordered us to split up and search the area. I paired up with Corporal Davis, and we headed toward the outskirts of the village, where the old stone houses gave way to the open desert. That's when we saw it, a cave half buried in the side of a rocky hill. It wasn't on any of our maps, and there were no signs that it had ever been used by the locals. "Let's check it out," Davis said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to go near it. The mouth of the cave looked like a gaping wound in the earth, dark and forbidding. But orders were orders, so we approached cautiously. As we got closer, a foul smell hit us, rotting meat mixed with something metallic. My stomach churned, but I pressed on, rifle at the ready. Inside, the cave was pitch black, the air thick and oppressive. We clicked on our flashlights, sweeping the beams across the stone walls. There were markings, ancient, carved deep into the rock. They looked like no language I had ever seen, twisted symbols that seemed to move if you stared at them for too long. At the back of the cave we found a small alcove. In the center of it was a pile of bones, human bones. Some of them were old, brittle and yellowed with age, but others looked fresh, the flesh still clinging to them. Davis cursed under his breath, backing away. "What the hell is this?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there, fast. But as we turned to leave, the whispers started again, louder this time, echoing off the walls. They weren't just coming from outside, they were coming from within the cave. We bolted, running back toward the village as fast as we could. When we reached the others, I tried to explain what we had found, but the words wouldn't come out. I could still hear the whispers, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Cole could see that something was wrong, but he didn't press us. He just ordered the squad to pack up and return to the base. That night, the nightmare started. I dreamed of the cave, of the bones, and of the figures standing silently on the dunes. But there was something else too, something in the dark watching me. Its eyes were hollow, empty, but they burned with a malevolent hunger. It whispered to me in a language I couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. It wanted me. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat. But the worst part wasn't the nightmare, it was that I could still hear the whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there, scratching at the inside of my skull. Over the next few days, things got worse. Morales wasn't sleeping. He'd sit in the corner of the barracks, rocking back and forth, muttering under his breath. Davis refused to talk about the cave, but I could tell he was hearing the whispers too. Even the other guys were starting to act strange, paranoid, jumpy, like they were expecting something terrible to happen. And then one night it did. It was just after midnight when the alarms went off. I grabbed my gear and rushed outside, thinking we were under attack. But there were no gunshots, no explosions, just silence. The other guys were already out there, standing near the fence, staring into the desert. That's when I saw them, the figures. Dozens of them, standing on the dunes just like the one I had seen before. But this time there were more of them. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hungry. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the whispers were louder than ever, filling the air like a low hum. Cole ordered us to fall back, but it was too late. Morales broke ranks and started running toward the figures, screaming something I couldn't understand. We tried to stop him, but he was too fast. He disappeared into the darkness, and the whispers grew louder, like they were laughing at us. The figures melted away into the desert, and Morales was gone. The next morning we searched for him, but there was no trace. Cole filed an official report, listed Morales as MIA, but we all knew what had happened. The desert had taken him. The days that followed were a blur. The whispers didn't stop. They followed me everywhere, even in broad daylight. The other guys were hearing them too, but no one wanted to talk about it. We were all on edge, waiting for something to happen, but we didn't know what. Then one night, Davis snapped. He came into my bunk, wild-eyed and shaking. "We have to go back," he whispered. "We have to go back to the cave." I tried to talk him down, but he was insistent. He said the whispers wouldn't stop until we did what they wanted. He said they had Morales and they would come for the rest of us if we didn't go back. I didn't believe him, but part of me was terrified he was right. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go with him. We snuck out of the base that night, under the cover of darkness, and made our way back to the cave. The desert was eerily silent, the whispers louder than ever in my mind. When we reached the cave, the stench hit us again, rotting flesh and something else, something older, more ancient. Davis went in first and I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. The markings on the walls seemed to writhe and twist in the beam of my flashlight, and I could feel something watching us from the shadows. At the back of the cave, where the bones had been, there was something new, a figure hunched over, its back turned to us. It was gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones, and it was whispering, its voice a low, rasping hiss. Davis froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Morales," he whispered. The figure turned slowly and I felt my blood run cold. It wasn't Morales. It wasn't even human. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a man's, hollow eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. Its mouth was too wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth, and its skin was cracked and dry like old leather. It smiled at us. The whispers grew deafening and I realized too late that we had made a terrible mistake.